On the 29th of May, 1453, an emperor took off the parts of his armor that marked him as an emperor. His name was Constantine the 11th. The walls of his city had been breaking under cannon fire for 53 days, and they had just failed. Somewhere in the fighting at the gate, he went in, as a man, not as a monarch, and was never seen again. His body was never identified. There is no tomb. He was the last Roman emperor. Not the last emperor of some successor state. Not the last emperor of a kingdom that remembered Rome fondly. The last man in an unbroken line of Roman emperors that runs back through Constantine, through Diocletian, through Marcus Aurelius, through Augustus, to a republic that threw out its king in 509 BC. 2,000 years of the same office, ending at a gate in a burning city. The first emperor of that city was called Constantine. So was the last. You were probably taught that the Roman Empire fell in 476. This is the story of the part that didn't. All 1100 years of it, from the day it was founded to the morning it ended. Chapter 1. The Second Rome. Start in the year 330, with a man solving a practical problem. The Emperor Constantine had a difficulty familiar to anyone running a very large organization from the wrong office. The empire's money, its grain, its trade, and most of its people were in the east. Its capital was in Italy. Every decision arrived late, so he built a new one. He chose a Greek town called Byzantine, sitting on a spit of land where Europe stops and Asia begins. Look at where it is, and you can see the whole thing. It controls the strait between two seas. It can be supplied by water when it is surrounded by land, and it can only be attacked head-on from one narrow direction. It is geographically the most defensible, important place in the world. He named it after himself, as emperors do. Constantinople. Here is the part that matters. Constantine did not move the capital, he made a second one. The empire now had two centers, two administrations, two halves that could each survive the other. Within a century, that arrangement had hardened into a formal split. An Eastern empire and a Western one, two emperors, one theory that it was all still a single state. That decision, made for boring logistical reasons, is the reason there is a story left to tell. The West was about to have a very difficult 200 years. Chapter 2. The Half That Didn't Stop. In 476, a Germanic commander named Odoacer deposed a teenage emperor in Italy, decided not to appoint a replacement, and sent the imperial regalia east. That is the date in the textbook, the fall of Rome. Now go and look at what was happening in Constantinople that year. Taxes were collected, laws were issued, the grain fleet came in from Egypt. The Emperor Zeno received Odoacer's messengers, was irritated by them, and got on with a difficult week. Nothing had ended. From where he sat, a troublesome province had become more troublesome. This is the single most useful thing to understand about the next 1,000 years, so I am going to say it plainly. The Eastern Empire did not think of itself as a new country that inherited Rome. It thought of itself as Rome. It had the same laws, the same offices, the same treasury, the same emperor in an unbroken line. Its citizens called themselves Romaeoi, Romans, for the entire 1100 years. So did their enemies. When the Ottomans finally took the city, they called their new province Rum, Rome. Nobody in this story ever called themselves Byzantine. We will come back to that, because the story of that word is the best ending I have got. They did change, of course. The empire's language slid from Latin to Greek, because that is what people there actually spoke. Its religion became the organizing fact of public life. But an institution that changes is not an institution that died. By that standard, Britain fell sometime in the 18th century. Chapter 3. Putting it back together. In 527, the throne went to a man who could not let it go. Justinian came from a peasant family in the Balkans and rose through an uncle who had risen through the army. He married a woman named Theodora, who had been an actress, which in the 6th century was a polite word for something else, and who turns out to be the more impressive of the two. Justinian wanted the empire back, all of it, and for about 30 years he very nearly got it. His generals took North Africa in a season. They took Italy twice because the first time did not hold. They took the southern coast of Spain. For one strange moment, the Mediterranean was a Roman lake again, exactly as it had been 3 centuries earlier. At home, he did something that outlasted all of it. He had every Roman law of the previous 1,000 years collected, contradictions removed, and published as a single coherent code, the Corpus Juris Civilis. If you live in continental Europe, or Latin America, or Japan, or half a dozen other places, the legal system you live under grew out of that book. It is probably the most consequential thing anyone in this video did. And he rebuilt the great church of the city, Hagia Sophia, in under 6 years, with a dome so wide that visitors reported it seemed suspended from heaven by a chain. It held the record for the largest enclosed space on Earth for almost 1,000 years. It is still standing. You can go. Then it went wrong, in the way these stories go wrong. In 532, riots in the Hippodrome nearly removed him. The revolt was ended by trapping the crowd inside and killing them. The figure given is tens of thousands. In 541, the plague arrived, the first recorded pandemic of that disease, and killed a share of the empire's population that historians still argue over and nobody puts at less than devastating. He left the empire larger than he found it and far too big to hold. Almost everything he reconquered was gone within a lifetime. Chapter 4: The Century of Losing. The 7th century is where this empire nearly ends, 400 years early. It opens with the last great war between Rome and Persia, the 2 superpowers of the region at it for 26 years, both fighting past the point of sense. The Persians took Egypt, Syria, and Jerusalem. The Emperor Heraclius eventually won it back in a campaign that reads like fiction. Both empires ended the war exhausted, broke, and stripped of soldiers. And then, from the south, came something neither had planned for. Within a single generation, Arab armies took Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. Not raids, permanent conquest of the richest and most populous provinces the empire had. Egypt was the grain. Syria was the tax base. Both were gone inside about 15 years. The empire lost more than half its territory and something like 3/4 of its revenue. What was left was Anatolia, the Aegean, the Balkan coast, and the city. The empire that comes out the other side of that century is a different creature, poorer, harder, permanently on a war footing, organized around defending a frontier rather than expanding one. Most states do not survive that. Historians who work on this period tend to describe the 7th century not as a decline, but as the empire being sawn down to a stump, and then, unexpectedly, growing back. Chapter 5: The Fire and the Walls. Twice, an Arab army came for Constantinople itself, once in the 670s, once in 717. Both times taking the city would have opened the whole of Eastern Europe. Both times it held. 3 things held it. The first is the walls. In the 5th century, the Emperor Theodosius built a defense in depth across the landward side of the city. A moat, then an outer wall, then a terrace, then an inner wall 12 meters high with 96 towers. For 1,000 years, nobody got through them. Attackers who tried simply sat outside until their army fell apart. The second is the sea. The city could be resupplied by ship, which meant a siege on land was not a siege at all. It was just an expensive way to camp. The third is the one everybody remembers. Greek fire, a liquid the Byzantine navy sprayed from tubes mounted on the bows of their ships, which burned on contact and went on burning on water. Enemy fleets caught by it did not fight. They scattered. Nobody knows what it was. That is not a dramatic flourish, it is the actual state of the evidence. The formula was a state secret held by a handful of families, and it was so well kept that it was lost. Probably some petroleum distillate, and beyond that, guesses. The one Byzantine weapon everyone has heard of, and we cannot make it. 2 sieges, both broken. It is genuinely hard to overstate this. If either had gone the other way, the map of Europe would be a different map. Chapter 6: The War Over Pictures. Now for the strangest 120 years in the story, in which the empire, having survived everything, went to war with itself about paintings. The question was whether religious images were holy or whether they were idols. The commandment says no graven images. The churches were full of them. For most of Christian history, this had been a tension people lived with. In 726, an emperor decided it was not. What followed is called iconoclasm, image breaking. Icons were destroyed on imperial order. Monasteries that resisted were closed and their occupants punished. Then the policy reversed. Then it came back. Then it was reversed again, permanently, in 843. It is easy to tell this as an absurd story, and I have partly told it that way. So let me be honest about two things. The first is that it was not really about paintings. It was about who defines holiness, the emperor or the church. Arriving during the century, the empire was losing catastrophic wars, which is exactly when people go looking for what they have done to deserve it. The second is that we are reading this from one side. The image supporters won and then wrote the histories, and the losing side's arguments survive mostly as quotations inside documents attacking them. When a historian tells you confidently what the iconoclasts believed, be a little careful. So am I. Chapter 7. The Golden Century. Then, improbably, the good part. From the middle of the 9th century, the empire under the Macedonian dynasty stops defending and starts advancing. It takes back Crete, Cyprus, Antioch. It pushes the frontier east for the first time in 300 years. Its missionaries convert the Slavs, which is why there is an Orthodox Christianity in Russia and Serbia and Bulgaria today, and why the alphabet used across a large part of the world descends from one designed by two Byzantine brothers. Constantinople in this period is the largest and richest city in Europe by a distance that is difficult to convey. Visitors from the West describe it the way you would describe a rumor. Its silk workshops, its hospitals, its street lighting, its civil service with an actual promotion structure. These were things Paris and London would not have for centuries. The high point is Basil II, who ruled for 49 years and left the empire larger, richer, and with a full treasury. He is remembered by a nickname, the Bulgar Slayer, and a story about blinding 15,000 prisoners. I will say what the sources actually support, which is, that story appears a long time afterwards. The number is the kind of number chroniclers reach for, and serious historians treat it as, at best, greatly exaggerated. The war was real and it was brutal. The famous atrocity may not have happened at all. When Basil died in 1025, the empire was the strongest state in the Christian world. 46 years later, it lost its army. Chapter 8. One bad afternoon. In 1071, at a place called Manzikert, a Byzantine army met a Seljuk Turkish one and lost. The emperor was captured. You will often hear that this is the disaster that killed the empire. That is the tidy version, and it is wrong, in an interesting way. The battle was not an annihilation. Casualties were moderate. The Seljuk Sultan treated his captive emperor decently and released him on terms that were, by the standards of the period, mild. The catastrophe was what happened next. The emperor came home to find a rival on his throne. What followed was a decade of civil war between Byzantine factions, each hiring Turkish troops to fight the others, each stripping the eastern frontier of the garrisons that were supposed to be facing outward. Anatolia was not conquered. It was left open, repeatedly, on purpose, by people who wanted the throne more than they wanted the province. And Anatolia was where the soldiers came from. Losing it did not just cost the empire land, it cost it the ability to raise armies, permanently. From this point on, Byzantine emperors fight with mercenaries and allies, which means Byzantine foreign policy becomes the management of people who are being paid to be there. One of those requests for help, sent west to the Pope asking for soldiers, helped trigger the Crusades, which is where this gets much worse. Chapter 9. The Christians. In 1202, a crusade set out for Egypt. It was underfunded from the start. The Venetians had built a fleet for an army twice the size of the one that turned up, and wanted paying. What happened over the next 2 years is still argued about by historians, whether it was a plan or a sequence of debts and detours and bad decisions that each made sense on their own. I lean towards drift rather than design, and I want to be clear that this is a genuine argument and not a settled one. What is not argued about is the result. In April 1204, a Christian crusading army stormed and sacked Constantinople, the largest Christian city on earth, the city they had come to help. They burned a great part of it. They killed and raped for 3 days. They stripped the churches, including Hagia Sophia, of everything that could be carried, and broke up much of what could not. Relics, libraries, and 800 years of accumulated art went west in crates. Some of it is still there. 4 bronze horses from the hippodrome stood over the door of a basilica in Venice for centuries. The empire was partitioned between the Crusaders. A Byzantine successor state took the city back in 1261, and technically the empire lasted another 200 years. But it was a city with a hinterland and a title. The treasury never recovered. The trade was in Venetian and Genoese hands. Whole districts of the capital lay empty. Travelers describe fields inside the walls. 1453 gets called the fall of Constantinople. A good number of Byzantinists will tell you the empire actually died in 1204 and spent 2.5 centuries being buried. Chapter 10, 53 days. By 1453, the Roman Empire was a city, a couple of islands, and a scrap of Greece. The Ottomans held everything around it, on both sides. It had been surrounded, in effect, for 2 generations. The Sultan was 21 years old. Mehmed II was not a barbarian at the gates. He was a highly educated and extremely capable young ruler who had decided that the city in the middle of his empire was going to be his capital, and who understood exactly what had always stopped everyone else: the walls. So he brought a gun. The great bombard cast for the siege was around 8 meters long and threw a stone ball of half a ton. It could be fired perhaps a handful of times a day, and it was wildly inaccurate. It did not need to be either. It needed to hit the same stretch of wall for weeks. Inside were somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 defenders, including a few hundred Italians who had come to help. Outside, estimates run from 50 to 80,000. Everyone knew the arithmetic. They held for 53 days. On the 29th of May, the walls were breached at several points at once. The fighting in the streets that followed and the sack that came after were what the sack of a stormed city was in that century, and I am not going to dress that up or dwell on it. Mehmed rode into Hagia Sophia the same day and ordered it preserved as a mosque. He took the title Caesari Rum, Caesar of Rome, and the last emperor went into the fighting at the gate, and that is where the story started. So, one last thing about the word. Every person in this video called themselves a Roman. Their empire's legal name for 1100 years was the Empire of the Romans. Their enemies called them Romans. The Ottomans named the conquest Rome. The word Byzantine was invented in 1557, 104 years after the empire ended, by a German scholar called Hieronymus Wolff, who needed a tidy label for a volume of Greek chronicles. It was adopted enthusiastically, and it was adopted for a reason. Western Europe had built its own claim to be Rome's inheritance and could not have a Greek-speaking Orthodox empire in the East holding the actual unbroken line. Calling them Byzantines solved that. It made an 1100-year continuation into a foreign thing with its own name. It worked so well that we now use Byzantine as an insult meaning needlessly complicated. A civilization with a functioning civil service, hospitals, public lighting, and a professional bureaucracy in a Europe that had none of those things is remembered in English as a word for pointless complexity. They were not the shadow of Rome. They were Rome, the part of it that made the right decision about where to put the capital and then spent 1100 years paying for everyone else's. The empire that everybody knows fell in 476. The empire that actually fell in 1453, and by then Gutenberg was printing books and Columbus was a toddler. 2,200 years from a village on a river to a gate in a burning city. Nobody alive at either end would have believed the other one.